All right, so we're looking at chapter 3 here in your regular NASM textbook. This is going to be our third PowerPoint as well. And so we are looking at the cardiorespiratory system today, right? So that is going to be where we talk about someone's cardiovascular and respiratory capabilities, how good are you at endurance? How well does your heart rate recover? Things like that. So purpose of this lesson, we want to have a pretty fundamental overview and knowledge of the cardiorespiratory system, sort of what it is, like how it functions, what its anatomy is. And then after this lesson, we want to be able to, describe the structure of their cardiovascular system, the structure of your respiratory system, and how those two systems come together to make up your cardiorespiratory system. So there's another example of like interdependent systems, right? Like your cardiovascular system pumps everything around your body. Your respiratory system gathers those nutrients in the form of oxygen from the atmosphere. We need to explain how that relates to movement, because our ability to extract that oxygen is what gives our cells energy throughout our body and allows us to do physical work. So when we know that like somebody has trouble doing that, they're not going to be quite as efficient at their ability to actually like move around and stuff. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And we're also going to talk about like how those breathing patterns can also be related to human movement. We'll very briefly, just at the very end, discuss how like dysfunctional breathing patterns actually can alter your posture, and that can lead to all kinds of different problems. So we'll be looking at that as well. So what is the cardiorespiratory system? What am I talking about when I say that? Right, well, the cardiorespiratory system is actually comprised of two, like I said, interdependent systems. It's comprised of your cardiovascular and your respiratory systems, and it's responsible for gathering and delivering oxygen throughout the body, right? So the cardiovascular system is the delivery system, and the respiratory system is gathering it from our atmosphere, right? And so that is, both of those systems come together to make up cardiorespiratory in general, right? And together they are what ensure proper cellular functioning throughout your entire body. Like your cells can't survive without oxygen. They need oxygen in order to be able to survive. We actually call, like, when your cells bring in oxygen and then like they spit out like waste products in the form of what we call CO2 every day. When we look, right? I don't know what it is. When we look at the cells on a cellular level, they bring in oxygen and they spit out CO2, which is totally a small example of the same thing that you do, right? You bring in massive amounts of oxygen, you exhale CO2 when we're breathing. And that's basically like a large version of, the reason you're doing that is because your cells are doing the same thing on a microscopic level. So when we look at it, right, your cardiovascular system, if we're labeling this out, this is going to be your heart, all of your blood, and your blood vessels. So that's the system as it comes together, right? The heart itself is sort of powering the entire cardiovascular system. The blood vessels allow, well, the blood is this special material that's able to like carry oxygen and other nutrients around the body, and waste products as well. It's able to carry all kinds of stuff. And then your blood vessels is a series of hollow tubes that allow for that blood to actually travel and get to where it needs to go. So, that's, if you think of your heart as like powering everything, the blood vessels are kind of like a highway, and the blood cells are kind of like, everything traveling around that highway. So that's your cardiovascular system. And then your respiratory system is your respiratory pump, which is going to be everything that drives oxygen into and out of your body, and your respiratory passageways, which allow, bits of oxygen to travel down and create massive amounts of surface area for that oxygen to be able to diffuse into the blood. So this is providing a means by which, blood can get exposed to those nutrients, and this is, the blood itself. So looking at the cardiovascular system first, right? Like I said, it's the heart, your blood, and all of your blood vessels. The first thing we need to talk about is the heart. NASA wants you to know a pretty good amount of anatomy here. when it comes to your heart. And so what the heart is this muscular organ, right? This pump that's designed to push blood throughout the body. And its main job, the main purpose of your heart is to generate and maintain pressure. So pressure is really, really important here because that's actually what's driving blood in different directions. Like if you're sitting upright, you need to get blood up to your head against gravity, and you need to drop it down to your legs. But you could just flip over and stand on your hands for a little while, or stand on your head or whatever. And the exact same thing is still going to happen. Your body can still pump blood against gravity up to your feet. It can still drive blood down to your head no matter what your body position is. So that's what your heart does. It's able to push this blood around because it's able to generate pressure. And the way it generates pressure is it has all these really cool little chambers in it, right? And these chambers are opening up and closing down, and that those little valves that are in that chamber are sort of how you're doing that, right? So you can kind of think of it, actually, I wish I had like a water bottle, but you can kind of think of like your heart generating pressure. Think of like a water bottle with a lid on it, right? Like if you squeeze that, because you've got muscles in your hand, you squeeze that water bottle, the lid's on there. So now you're increasing the pressure inside of that bottle. You guys ever do that where you twist up the bottle and then you spin the cap off and the cap goes shooting away, right? The reason that happens is because there's an incredible amount of pressure building up in that bottle, and all of a sudden you release it, and all of that like air from inside the bottle goes shooting out, right? Or it would happen if like the bottle was, if it was filled with water, if you squeezed it really hard and then just opened the lid, all of a sudden the water would go ejecting out of the bottle. Your heart does the exact same thing. It's got these chambers that fill with blood, and then it has these valves that close down and keep that blood from being able to escape the heart. But then the heart squeezes, so all this pressure builds up, and then all of a sudden that valve opens, and boom, a bunch of blood goes shooting out of the heart, and it travels, up to your brain or down to your feet or wherever it needs to go. So, like I said, it's a muscular pump designed to push blood throughout the body, and it's made up of these specialized fibers that we're going to call cardiac muscle. So yesterday, we talked a whole bunch about muscle, right? We talked about how it's all of these actin and myosin fibers and things like that, right? And they're creating these overlaps so that they can, shorten and relax, right? That's when you look at a muscle cell, it's able to shorten like this and relax. Well, cardiac muscle looks pretty similar, actually. Like if you look at like cardiac muscle, it also has overlapping fibers of actin and myosin. It's got the same exact sort of structure there that you can kind of see, right? The only difference that you're going to see in cardiac muscle is you're going to see these little discs right here. These are called intercalated discs. And that actually allows electricity to travel more effectively and more quickly throughout your heart. Those intercalated discs are really good at making sure that electricity is traveling through all the cells of your heart, which is really, really important because your heart needs to be able to generate electricity even more so than any other, even more so than like any of the other type of muscle inside your body. Because we want our heart to start beating, and we really don't want it to ever stop, right? And then the other thing you'll see these little like dark bits right here. Those are actually the nucleuses of your heart muscle cells. And you'll notice there's way less of them compared to like your standard muscular tissue. So we don't have as many nuclei. And you remember the nucleus is kind of like the brain of a cell, right? So because there's not as many like brains, there's not as many decision makers, which is a really good thing in your heart muscle, because one of the things that we want to have happen in heart muscle is that we want it to be able to contract all at the same time. We want everything to be in sync. And anybody in here who's ever worked at a company who has like multiple managers will tell you, you don't want to have too many bosses bossing you around. Like you don't want too many cooks in the kitchen. Because when that happens, like, one person says one thing and another person, and then all of a sudden it gets out of sync. And when that happens in your heart muscles, your heart's not generating pressure anymore. So they're much more tightly compacted than skeletal muscle. They have these intercalated discs, and they don't have as many nuclei, which is what allows them to sort of contract all at the same time. So that's kind of a special structure. It looks very similar to skeletal muscle, but not quite. Also, the fibers are going to be much, 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 much smaller than skeletal muscle, because your heart is not exactly lifting dumbbells, you know? So it's definitely a very much like, remember we talked about how type 1, that's your endurance type muscle fibers, and type 2 is your maximum strength muscle fibers. Well, your heart is like 0.5 type 0.5 muscle fibers. Like, this is the super endurance, never gets tired, never stops working type of muscle fibers. We want it to be able to beat from before we are born, you know, until the day we expire. So we really never want that to disappear. So that is your heart muscle, right? In a typical heart, when it's beating, when we describe that, it's usually of about 70 to 80 beats per minute when we look at it, right? So your heart muscle is termed cardiac muscle, like we said. Its characteristics are similar to skeletal muscle, but a little bit different. One of the other things is that cardiac muscle fibers, they contract involuntarily. Your cardiac muscle fibers will, they are under the control of your autonomic nervous system. They're under the control of the part of your nervous system that you don't really have any conscious control over, right? Like if I made you, like everybody in here, I want you to think of the most awkward thing that happened to you recently. Like maybe you're, you know, something weird, just like you're at the grocery store and they were like, all right, enjoy your groceries. And you were like, you too, you know, and you're like, oh God, that's weird. You know, just think about like something awkward or weird like that. Chances are, just thinking of that weird little awkward nature, your heart might have started beating just a little bit faster, right? Or think about the last time, you know, somebody, you know, swerved out, or you're watching a scary movie and you're like, oh God, that's so creepy, right? Your heart kind of starts beating a little bit faster. You don't have any real control over that. That's very autonomic, right? So involuntary autonomic reactions, and then your heart is located in this area in the center of your chest that we call your sternum, or mediastinum, if you want to say it that way. And basically that's just this area right in the center here of your chest where your heart is located here, and then you've got your lungs flanking it on both sides. So that's your mediastinum, whatever you want to say. So when we look at cardiac muscle contractions, right? Like I said earlier, cardiac muscle fibers are shorter and more tightly connected than your regular skeletal muscle fibers. And the reason for that is because that enables when one fiber contracts, it's going to kind of pull those other fibers to contract with it. And again, that keeps them all in sync, right? So this is like almost, it'd be like working out with someone attached to you. You know, you'd both be lifting kind of at the same time. And so that enables one fiber to kind of simultaneously stimulate other fibers. And they all have this really cool kind of built-in contraction rhythm, which is really, really great, actually. And the fibers that have the highest rhythm are actually the ones that determine your heart rate. So again, those intercalated discs that are kind of running throughout your muscle fibers, that's sort of helping generate that electric signal that's running across everything. That's sort of helping with keeping your heart all in sync and pacing at the same time, which is one of the most important things that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. We really want your heart, whenever it's beating, we want it to stay in sync. We want all the fibers to contract simultaneously, right? We want this kind of thing to happen. We want the heart to squeeze like this. What we don't want to have is where it gets out of rhythm like this, right? Where I'm squeezing at kind of random different times on each side. That means that like when you've got high pressure being generated in one part of the heart, the other part might be generating low pressure. And if that happens, blood's gonna backflow instead of traveling where it needs to go. This is all about generating pressure as efficiently and as effectively as possible. So if you cannot get all the fibers contracting simultaneously, you can't generate pressure as well, right? It's kind of like a tug of war. You know, you don't want when you're in a tug of war, you want everybody pulling really hard simultaneously. You don't want one guy resetting his grip while all the rest of you are pulling really hard, and then all of a sudden he's pulling really hard while you're all adjusting your grip. That's essentially like not even having somebody on your team. The typical discharge rate, like I said, it's about 70 to 80 beats per minute. And that beat, that rate of your heart rate is actually controlled by this really cool little structure inside of your heart called your SA node. We call it the SA node. Its real name is the sinoatrial node. Actually, that's a great picture right there. Oh, there we go, high quality. So your sinoatrial node, it's this little node right here. And this is actually what's determining your entire heart rate. So this little sensor right here gets signals from your nervous system saying, hey, speed up, or hey, slow down. Or sometimes it's not even your nervous system. Sometimes it's your endocrine system, right? We talked about hormones yesterday. If you drop adrenaline on your SA node, it will speed up your heart rate. And so you can actually do that. We did that, this horrible experiment when we were in school, where we dropped like adrenaline on like a dead frog's heart. And sure enough, it started beating again. And it was like, ugh. But that's because this little node here has this kind of built-in rhythm to the cells. So if you drop that kind of material onto this node here, it will pick up or slow down the rhythm. If you were to run serotonin or dopamine or some other hormones that are, rest and digest hormones, that would kind of slow your heart rate down. So it's under the control of both your autonomic nervous system and your endocrine system. So what happens is the SA node is sending the signal throughout the rest of the heart, telling your heart how fast it is supposed to beat. So what it'll do is it'll travel from the SA node over here to what's called your AV node. And the AV node's job is to kind of delay the signal for just a second. You'll notice the SA node is kind of controlling. There's also a little fiber up here. The SA node is kind of controlling this top section of the heart here. And then the AV node actually kind of splits down to the bottom of the section of the heart down here. And when you look at your heartbeat, I'm going to look up heartbeat GIF, and I guarantee, oh no, there's a real one. I was like, these are all going to be Valentine's hearts. All right, this is great. Is it great? Come on, internet. Help a guy out. There we go. So you see how it's kind of beating like, top to bottom, top to bottom, top to bottom. I know I just talked about how like we want the rhythm to kind of all be the same, but we do actually want it to contract like top first, bottom second. So that's the like, do-do, 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 do-do that you're kind of experiencing in a heart rhythm, right? Again, top to bottom, top to bottom, top to bottom. So what happens is the SA node is setting the rhythm, and then the AV node delays the signal for just a second, and then it splits out to the rest of the heart, and that's where it happens. And what that squeezing up top, then squeezing down below thing does is these chambers up at the top of the heart, this chamber here and this chamber here, are able to fill with blood. And then when it squeezes, that generates a bunch of pressure. Meanwhile, this is in the middle of relaxing because it just got done with the last heartbeat. So now, once this squeezing is done, that shoots all that blood from this chamber down here and all the blood from this chamber down here. So now you've got blood in this chamber and you've got blood in this chamber. Then that part starts to relax because its beat is over. And so these valves close down. And then the bottom part of your heart finally does its contraction and it beats, and then its valves open up. And what that does is that shoots blood out of your heart. So you're going, when you get that like top bottom rhythm, right? You've got like a squeezing, and then you've got an opening, and then that squeezing puts blood down here. And then all of a sudden it squeezes as this part opens up, and that shoots blood out of the heart. Meanwhile, this top part of the heart fills. So you've got like push, fill, right? And it's kind of going at this interesting little rhythm there. I've never really mastered that hand motion just yet, but I'm getting closer every time I teach this class. So that is your sinoatrial node. Now we have a name for this that's a nickname. Like I said, this is responsible for controlling the rhythm of the heart. We will typically refer to this as the pacemaker of the heart. And this is located in your right atrium. Now, I want to tell you guys something that I totally missed the very first time I ever studied the heart when I was in college. I don't know if I was absent. I don't know if I wasn't paying attention. But it was like I was brand new into school, you know, hadn't really studied anatomy or biology or anything all that much just yet. I was a new student. And I missed it when our teacher explained, you know, that this picture is from the anatomic position, which means the heart is facing you, right? Like it's facing this way. So this is the right atrium, even though it's on the left side of the picture. This is the left atrium, even though it's on the right side of the picture. These are reversed because it's from the view. This is the left chamber of the heart. This is the right chamber of the heart. All right, I'm sorry, I have that backwards. Right chamber of the heart, good God, see? Right chamber of the heart because it's on the left side. Left chamber of the heart because it's on the freaking right side. That always confuses me every time. Anyway, this is your right atrium. That is where your SA node lives, okay? So the sinoatrial node is responsible for the rhythm of the heart. It lives in the right atrium, and we refer to it as the pacemaker of the heart. That's its nickname. So you will probably have a question on your homework or on your exams, and you'll probably get a real question on your actual NASM test as well. That is like one version of one of these things. They will probably ask you about the SA node at some point. Good God. Sorry, my coffee is just like gunking up my throat this morning. So that's the SA node there, right? Then you've got all of your the other structures you've got all your internodal pathways, right? Those are all the wires almost that you kind of see here, right? And then you'll see your AV node, right? That's the one that kind of delays the signal. And then your AV node will go down to what is called your AV bundle, which you can't really see they're not doing a great job of drawing it in this one. But if you look at this like big bundle right here, and then like it branches out like crazy, that's called the bundle of His. And then these are what are called Purkinje fibers. Really, the only ones they're ever going to ask you about is the sinoatrial node, which creates the signal, and the AV node, which delays the signal. But really, they're probably only going to ask you about the SA node. All right, so that's the conduction part of the heart, right? That's how your heart generates electric signals so that it can, you know, squeeze, right? Remember, whenever a muscle gets zapped, that muscle contracts, and so that's the part of the heart that's doing the zapping, right? So then let's look at these chambers of the heart, and this is one that kind of gets to be, you know, this sometimes is kind of a pain in the butt because you do want to know these chambers and you want to have them pretty well memorized here. So if we look at the chambers of the heart, you're going to have them split into two major categories, okay? Two major categories. You're going to have atriums, or atria, I guess I should say, and ventricles, okay? So the atriums are the upper chambers, and you want to think of like, you know, if you've ever heard the word atrium before, right? Like actually, let's see here. If I type in, I mean, my search history is full of anatomy stuff, but if I type in atrium, yeah, you'll see here, right? It's kind of like the big empty chamber in a building, right? It's where it's like a gathering site. It's like, hey, gather in the atrium, you know, and then we'll take you upstairs, you know? You see like an atrium in like a mansion. It's always where there's like a big kind of gathering site in here, or like sometimes you see that classic like grand staircase that goes up two different directions. It's always in like a haunted house, right? That's what an atrium is. It's a gathering site, right? Well, the same thing is true in your heart. If you look at like the atrium of the heart, it is this chamber that gathers blood once that blood has come back to the heart. So, you know, I've got a right atrium here, and I've got a left atrium here. And you can see, like, see this little blood vessel here, and this little blood vessel right here? You see the little holes, right? So this is your superior, what's called your vena cava, and this is your inferior vena cava. And that's dumping blood back into the heart. Meanwhile, it's kind of hard to see, but you see this little, like, tube back here, that's actually going to travel through and it's going to put blood in right here. And then these two little tubes right here, that's going to put blood in right here. That is blood that's traveling to the left atrium from the lungs, right? So you've got your right atrium, which is receiving blood as it returns back from the body. And you get your left atrium, which is receiving blood as it's returning back from the lungs. So those are the chambers that are responsible for gathering blood in the heart, right? So again, here you can kind of see it in this version, right? Right atrium here, left atrium here. They're both gathering blood that has returned to the heart, okay? So those are the first two chambers. Those are the atrias. The atrias are chambers that gather blood. And like I said, the right atrium is responsible for gathering blood that is returning to the heart from the body. So remember, blood's job is to get down to, your glutes while you're doing squats, deliver some oxygen and then pick up some CO2 and then travel back to the heart so they can drop off that CO2 in the lungs and pick up more oxygen. But we got to get that blood, from the body to the heart to the lungs, back to the heart, back to the body. And then once it's done with that, that's the loop, right? Heart to body to heart to lungs to heart to body to heart to lungs, right? That's sort of how blood is sort of traveling. And so it's got to continue coming back here. So if we look at a blood cell, let's say it starts in this right atrium, that's a blood cell. It just got done delivering some oxygen to my left big toe, right? And now it's going to travel up through the body and it's going to get dumped into my right atrium, right? So it's going to gather blood there. Now, it doesn't have any oxygen in it, so its job is to get to the lungs and pick up some more oxygen. So now, once it's done connected in this atrium, it's got to travel down to a ventricle. And ventricles are chambers that pump blood out of the heart. So that blood cell, it delivered its oxygen, so now it travels back to the right atrium, and then it drops into my right ventricle over here. Then my heart's going to squeeze, and that right ventricle is going to shoot that blood cell up through this tube, and it's going to travel over to my lungs. Once it gets to my lungs, it's going to drop off CO2, and I'm going to go and exhale CO2. Then I'm going to inhale more oxygen. Now that blood cell picks up all that oxygen. It's got lots of oxygen that it's carrying, so it needs to get back to the body so it can deliver that oxygen. So now that blood cell is going to travel from my lungs back to my right atrium, where it'll get gathered up. Then left atrium, god dang it. It'll get back to my left atrium, where it'll get gathered up, and it'll drop into my left ventricle. And then my left ventricle will pump it out of the heart, and it'll travel to wherever it's going. This time, maybe it's heading to my brain, right? So it goes up here and then travels up these tubes and delivers some oxygen to my brain. Then it comes back down and it drops into the right atrium, right ventricle, lungs, left atrium, left ventricle, body, and then it just repeats that whole process over and over and over again, right? So a blood cell is always going to travel in an atrium first before it will drop into a ventricle to get pumped out of the heart. So atriums gather blood that's returning to the heart, ventricles pump blood out of the heart. Right atrium is responsible for gathering blood as it's returned from the body. Left atrium is responsible for gathering blood as it's returned from the lungs. And then your right ventricle and your left ventricle are going to pump in opposite directions. Your right ventricle will pump it to the lungs, and your left ventricle will pump it to the body. So again, our blood flow cycle, right atrium to right ventricle to the lungs, left atrium to left ventricle to the body, back to the right atrium, and the process repeats. And I know that gets very confusing, and you kind of just say it over and over again, and eventually we've said so many circles that it almost gets more confusing. But how's everybody feeling on that? Pretty good?
Very clear.
All right, I'll take it. Awesome. All right. I can't tell you guys. I shared with you how I got so confused in college. I literally had the heart backwards for like almost a whole semester. Like I just like missed it. And I just remember being confused for like weeks and just being like, man, he keeps saying the wrong side of the heart. And I was so arrogant. Like I was like, my teacher just keeps being wrong. He's like, looking at the heart. I mean, that's my left. This is my right. Anyway, so let's go ahead and look at how your heart functions, right? Let's look at the actual, like, job of the heart, when the heart's like doing all of its actual, work, right? So when we're looking at the function of the heart, we're going to measure all of this. We as personal trainers, one of our main jobs is to measure how well someone's heart's working, right? Like I want to observe how your heart is functioning when I give you a certain amount of exercise. If it functions really well, great. I'm going to give you a super hard cardio routine. But if your heart is struggling, well, then that shows me that a priority is to build up your heart's endurance and see if we can get you to a good place, And so that's where the function of the heart, when we're looking at it, we got to understand what is called cardiac output, right? So each contraction of your ventricles pushes blood from the heart, right? Again, the left ventricle is going throughout the whole body. The right ventricle is going to go to the lungs. So, your left ventricle, right? Let's spend just a little bit of special time on this. You look at this left ventricle right here, right? Look at how much more muscular this part of the heart is, right? So like this big thick wall here, this thick layer of the heart, this is called your myocardium. You think about like the word myo, we know that is like a prefix for whenever we're talking about muscle. So this is the muscular layer of the heart. And obviously like this chamber is larger, right? Like your right ventricle is really big, but see how much like thin the muscle is around it? Look at how thick the muscle is around like this left ventricle, right? So this is actually the reason why, when we place our hand over our heart, we usually go over our left side. Your heart is not here. Your heart is dead center. But we put it over the left because it does ever so slightly tilt like this, because this bottom section of the heart, this part right here, this little tipping point is heavier. And so that's what causes your heart to kind of tilt to the side. It's a much larger, thicker, more muscular part of the heart. So this is where all the muscle is located. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about what the left ventricle does, right? The left ventricle has got to squeeze so hard that it gets blood, against gravity from here up to my brain. And it's going to pump so hard. I'm 6'1". It's got to get it all the way down to my left pinky toe, which is about as far away from the heart as you can get, right? That's a couple feet away. And so like, it's got to squeeze like crazy to shoot that blood down to where it's going. So the left ventricle of the heart is really what we as trainers are sort of paying the most attention to. This is where we are sort of measuring things like pulse. Whenever you feel like your pulse, right? If you're doing it on your carotid or your radial and you feel that like thumping, that is the left ventricle pushing blood through those blood vessels. That's what you're measuring. And so when we look at the function of your heart, the overall function is going to be called cardiac output. Okay. And so like function is made up of two things here, right? There's two main things that sort of make up how your heart is actually sort of working. One of those things is how much blood can be shot every time your heart beats, right? Like that's one function of the heart. How much blood travels every time your heart squeezes, right? And then the other part of it is how often your heart can squeeze, right? So one is your heart rate, that's the number of beats, right? And one is the volume of blood that gets shot out of your heart every time your heart beats. And that's what we call your stroke volume. Those two things coming together is what makes up the overall performance of your heart. Your heart is made up of how much blood it can pump every time it pumps and how many times it can pump blood per minute. Those two things are the performance of your heart as a whole. So it is, you can think of cardiac output, like I said, the overall performance of the heart, and it's your heart rate times your stroke volume. Think of it as the volume of blood per minute, right? So when we look at this, we often look at this in like a math formula, right? And it's going to be your cardiac output equals your heart's rate, number of beats per minute, times stroke volume, amount of blood per beat, right? So this is what this formula looks like in short. By the way, they shorten, like heart rate makes sense. It's like HR, right? Stroke volume makes sense. It's like SV, right? HR times SV, but it equals Q, which always confuses people because people are like, why isn't it CO? The reason it's not is because that's technically a quotient, right? So that's why that formula looks that way. I don't want anybody to be confused when they like look and they're like, what the hell is the Q? It's the quotient of blood per minute. Sometimes you'll see this formula listed this way. I actually don't know if NASM will, but in the world, you might see it that way. Again, the amount of blood pumped, that's your stroke volume. The rate at which that blood is pumped, that's your heart rate. And they come together to make up your stroke volume or your cardiac output. Here's the thing. I want to know what your cardiac output is. As like a personal trainer, like I want to know what my client's cardiac output is. Unfortunately, we don't really have the ability to measure it directly, right? Like I can't hook you up to a machine in the gym to figure out what your stroke volume is, right? I can't measure how much blood is getting shot out of your heart every beat. I just don't have the equipment. I don't have the tools to do that in a gym setting, right? But what I can do is I can measure your heart rate, right? I can totally, measure your pulse. And since we know there's a connection here, right? We know there's a connection between heart rate and stroke volume. If your heart rate is super, super, super high, that's telling me that your heart is struggling to pump a lot of blood every time it beats. Let's look at two people who are both identical, right? One of them, they're identical twins, and one of them exercises every single day, and the other one never exercises at all. But they both weigh 150 pounds, right? They're both the same body, they're the same height. They're identical in a lot of ways, but one of them has a stronger heart than the other one does, right? So they both weigh 150 pounds. That means they have about the same amount of tissue on their body, right? Like their body is about the same number of cells, which means they have pretty much the same oxygen needs, right? They both need the same amount of oxygen getting delivered. Well, the person who exercises every day, their heart's so used to exercising and it's so strong that it's pumping at like 60 beats per minute when they're resting. So if they're just sitting around watching TV or something, their heart's going at about 60 beats per minute, right? That's about 1 beat every second. The person who never exercises, their heart has never been under any stress, so it's never gotten stronger. It's never had any reason to adapt to exercise. So it's never had any reason to learn how to beat harder. So the person number two, they have the same amount of like body, and they have the same oxygen delivery needs, but because their heart just can't pump as much blood every single time, it's beating at like, let's say 75 beats per minute. That's a difference of 15 beats per minute. So, we would say that the person whose heart rate is lower has a stronger heart. They have a higher stroke volume. I can't measure their stroke volume, but I can measure their heart rate. And I know that their heart rate is a reflection of their stroke volume, right? I always like to think of it as like, imagine I've got a stack of 5-pound plates over here. I've got 20 of them, right? I've got 20 little 5-pound plates over here, and I need to carry them down the hall, right? Well, if I'm taking one 5-pound plate at a time, I gotta take 20 trips, right? But if I can take 3 or 4, let's say I take 5 plates at a time, I've only got to take 4 trips. So I'm traveling less often because I'm stronger and I can carry more weight every time. And that is sort of how we want to understand cardiac output. This is the reason why when we do our cardio assessments, and Eugenia, I know you haven't actually heard of any of these assessments yet, but two of the cardio assessments that we're going to learn in this class are, one of them is called the YMCA step test, and one of them is called the Rockport walk test. And they're both cardio assessments. And you put somebody through them and you see how well they perform. So if I made you do a step for 3 minutes and then I measured your pulse and your pulse is really high, well, that shows me that you're not very good at cardio. But if you did that 3 minutes and your pulse is really low, that shows me that you're really good at cardio. Your heart is able to keep up with the amount of effort. And so now I know what type of cardio routine. If you did really poorly, I'm going to be really gentle at first, and I'm going to build your cardio up over time. But if you did really well, I'm going to give you a hard cardio routine so that we can make your heart, we can work on peak, high efficiency stuff. We work a little bit harder. Both are going to work really hard, but one's getting a higher percentage of maximal effort, and the other person, we're going to be a little safer. We're going to be a little gentler. And that's why we need to know about this stuff, is that tells us our assessments, right? All right, so we're gonna move away from the heart into blood, but do you guys have any questions about the heart? Is anything on the heart not clear before I move on? I'm a little worried. I hope you guys don't get like the cardiac tissue question. Sometimes like I'm a little, I like it's in here, the myocardium layer. And I've seen that question before, but it shouldn't be in this class because I know it's not in your notes. But the myocardium, that's the heart muscle. That's what we call it. But any questions about the heart? Anything at all? Everybody feeling good? Moving on to blood. All right, let's talk about vampires. No. All right, so looking at blood, blood's actually really quick. We don't spend too much time talking about blood in this class, but your blood is going to be this liquid connected. Actually, it's actually considered connective tissue, which I know is kind of weird, but if you think about like cutting yourself and then you get like a scab, it connects your skin back together. So it's actually a connective tissue in a weird way. But your blood is the material, the medium that is used to deliver essential nutrients throughout the body, right? So the most essential nutrient of all, we don't really think of it as a nutrient, but is air, is oxygen, right? That's the most essential nutrient. You can go you can go a day or two without water. You can go, a couple days without food. You can go a couple minutes without oxygen, So oxygen is the most essential nutrient you've got. All of your cells need oxygen delivery in order to survive, right? So blood is acting as the medium to deliver this, because when you look at a blood cell, which its full name is actually called an erythrocyte. When you look at a blood cell, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of this sort of, it looks in like almost like a filled in breath mint. It kind of looks like a weird breath mint or like a filled in donut. It's got this kind of concave shape on both sides there. And that's actually really important because that weird little shape allows it to squeeze through blood vessels. We're going to get to blood vessels here in just a second. But like that allows it to actually kind of fold and squeeze through a hole that might be too small for it. And it didn't look like this originally. Originally, your blood cells, they start out, actually, that's not at all what I was looking for. There we go. They start out kind of like this. They start out as sort of your normal human cell, right? All this little stuff inside. You've got little mitochondria in there and a nucleus and all these normal materials you find in human cells. And then as they get older, right here, they actually go bleh, and they spit out all of their organs. That'd literally be like you spitting out your digestive system. And what that does is that it kind of causes it to collapse in on itself. And it keeps all the materials that allow it to deliver nutrients, but it loses all the other stuff. And then that stuff's going to go back and get used to make a new red blood cell. And that's why your red blood cells are the shortest living cells in your body. They don't have any of the normal things inside of them that allow them that allow them to survive and like repair themselves. So, you know, you're making new red blood cells constantly. They're not surviving very long like your other cells do. And so that's sort of what a blood cell looks like. Now, in a blood cell, when you look at a red blood cell, you're going to see that it has this special protein in it called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin, it actually does look kind of like this. I love drawing proteins because they're just literally squiggles. But this is what hemoglobin looks like. So you can see like you've got these 4 little chains right here in hemoglobin, and there's a little molecule of iron in the dead center of all of it. So this is why if you've ever heard of somebody who, you know, is like anemic, somebody who's anemic, they're basically not producing enough hemoglobin. And how do you help somebody who's anemic? You give them more iron in their diet. You know, you'll encourage them to eat, you know, red meats or organ meats or things like that. But if they're vegetarian, that's going to include, you know, eating more things like dark leafy greens that often have iron in them. And so you're trying to enhance your iron intake when you have anemia, because what you're having trouble producing is hemoglobin. You don't have as much hemoglobin. And what hemoglobin does, see like the iron right here, iron really likes to bind to oxygen molecules. And so you see these little oxygen molecules here, they will run down and attach themselves to your red blood cell. And they attach because of that protein of hemoglobin, right? So blood is the medium that delivers this, because blood, and when you look at blood, by the way, it looks like this, blood components. When you look at blood, it's actually made up of a couple different materials. There's some water, there's a lot of water in there. You know, 55% of your blood is all this other extra stuff. 1% of it is platelets, things like your immune system. Your immune system's located right here. And then the rest of it is these red blood cells that I'm talking about, right? So blood's, you know, made up of all that stuff. It's all running through. That's actually kind of what your blood really looks like, which I know is kind of weird looking. See all that like weird fluid there? That's like lymph and stuff. But these red blood cells, that's what actually has this hemoglobin protein, you know, these little proteins living inside of all of it, that is allowing oxygen molecules to kind of grab a hold. And so the average person has about 1.5 gallons of blood in their body. And so you can lose about, you know, you can actually lose about 1/5 of that pretty safely. That's why when you go to donate blood, they'll take about 1 liter. And then they give you some orange juice in return, which will hopefully keep your blood sugar levels normal, and then your body will produce new red blood cells fairly quickly. And so, again, blood is going to transport oxygen, but it's also transporting other things. There's hormones running throughout your blood, sugar running throughout your blood, proteins running throughout your blood. It's also got waste products in there like lactic acid or carbon dioxide. You know, leftover materials that need to get expelled from your body. There's urea, you know, which is how your urine gets transported to your kidneys and then eventually out of your body. And so blood's got a lot of really cool, interesting jobs. Its job is to help regulate your temperature. You know, if you look at like, look at your skin, blood temperature regulation. Let's see if I can get a picture like I want. Yeah, that'll work. Oh, it's too small. Okay, this will actually kind of work. Okay, so here's sort of how the blood vessels in your skin, right, how they actually look, right? And so like if you're really hot, right, you're super, super warm, your body's gonna start sweating, and that is gonna put some liquid on top of your skin. And then air is gonna rush over that liquid, which will cause it to evaporate, and that will carry heat away from it and cool you down, right? So what'll happen is when you're really, really hot, your blood vessels right here will actually open up, and now blood is going to be exposed to that cooler temperature, and hopefully that will carry that colder temperature throughout your whole body, and that will cool you down. The exact opposite is true if you're really cold. If you're really cold, you know, your skin kind of shrivels up, you get the goosebumps, right? And what will happen is your blood vessels will actually constrict because they're trying to protect all the warmth inside of your body and keep it from leaking out of you. And so blood's job is to regulate your temperature, it's to regulate your pH levels, it's to clot, which protects you from losing too much blood. But its main job, the biggest thing we need to talk about, is the fact that blood contains hemoglobin. And that is a protein in your blood that binds to oxygen and allows blood cells to carry oxygen throughout the body. So it contains molecules of iron, and then that iron binds to the oxygen. And that's why your blood is red too, by the way. Because of the fact that it's got iron in it, and the fact that iron, when exposed to oxygen, turns bright red, which is what oxygen. That's why you know, rust is red colored. You know, when you see like rusty metal and stuff, it turns at this bright red color. That's also, yeah, sparks. That's actually a really good picture. The reason those sparks are red is because that's a whole bunch of iron that is, you know, being exposed to extreme heat, which is extreme oxygen. So fun little bits there. That's why your red blood cells are red. Any questions on blood? blood questions? Anything? Anybody got any of those? I'm feeling good. All right. So let's take a look at our blood vessels here. So we've got our heart, which is designed to pump blood throughout the body. Well, now we have to have a network of tubes for that blood to actually travel around. You know, we've got what's called a closed vascular system, right? It's a series of hollow tubes. We aren't like, and I know this is going to be weird, we aren't like a spider. Like if you look at like an open vascular system, it's kind of interesting when you look at like the way a lot of insects work. Oh God, there's a bee. Ugh, nope, not looking at that one. You'll notice that like there's a difference between a closed circulatory system and an open one. See how like there's some blood vessels, but for the most part, these are not like connected tubes. So in a lot of like insects, what they have is a heart that's located dead center in their body. And then whenever it beats, it kind of just splashes blood everywhere. And that's how they deliver oxygen. Their heart just kind of flings blood around the whole body randomly, rather than like a closed vascular system, which is like it beats and then travels, you know, to wherever it's going. Through like a series of tubes. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages, you know, like the open vascular system is great because you can move at like 1,000,000 miles an hour and then you're not really at any risk of like passing out. You know, like a cricket, like we saw in that picture, can jump super fast and all of its blood will travel over there, but it doesn't cause it to pass out because it can just splash right back in the other direction right afterwards. Us, if you make us move super, super fast, all the blood gets pulled away from our brain, and then we go, all right, I'm going to take a nap. And you pass out, which is why you see people faint on things like roller coasters sometimes. So that's bad, and sometimes they're just scared. But that's what your blood vessels are. They're this closed circuit running throughout your body that allows for the delivery of all kinds of stuff, right? So here's that closed circuit I talk about, right? You can see this circuit here is connected to this one, right? Remember, blood got pumped out of the heart, then it delivered oxygen. Now it doesn't have any oxygen in it, so we're going to start drawing it in blue, and then it's going to travel back here. Now, at no point in your body is your blood ever blue. That is a mistake that people make because it kind of looks blue under, you know, your skin and stuff. But that's totally not how it works. We draw it as blue because it is really, really, really dark red because it has no oxygen in it. There's very little oxygen molecules left. Whereas like when it comes right out of the heart, it's got lots of oxygen in it. So it's bright, bright, bright red. So we got bright red and then we got dark red, but we usually draw it as blue. So that blood gets pumped out of my heart, delivers some oxygen to my brain. Now it doesn't have any oxygen anymore, so it's darker. And so it will travel back to my heart so that it can get back to the lungs. And then it it was really dark. It drops off all of its CO2, picks up oxygen. Now it's bright red again. Heart, body, heart, lungs, heart, body, heart, lungs. And that's that connection that we talked about earlier, right? So We memorized it in twos earlier, right? We've got our atriums and we've got our ventricles. Well, now we've got two more categories here, which are in your blood vessels, right? So blood vessels is a closed circuit of hollow tubes that are transporting blood either to or from the heart. So the blood vessels that are carrying blood away from the heart, these are your arteries. If blood is traveling away from the heart, right? So like in this example here, it's traveling up and out around the body, right? So this is the biggest artery you've got. This is called this right here is your carotid artery, and this is called your aorta, which isn't even necessarily an artery. It's kind of its own thing, but it's blood's traveling away, so we're going to call it an artery. So that is your aorta right there. And so it will branch off and become like your carotid artery over here. And then it branches off and travels down. If it's traveling down your arm, that travels down like your brachial artery. And so this is going to travel all the way around like throughout your body. And if it's going away from the heart, those are your arteries, right? Then you've got veins, and veins are the opposite of arteries. Instead of traveling blood away from the heart, veins are going towards the heart. And so that's sort of how we want to look at this. We got arteries, which travel blood away from the heart, and we got veins, which travel blood to the heart. Now, blood vessels are actually pretty large. If you look at how large your aorta is, it's big. It's about the size of a hose, to be honest. Just a little bit smaller. Yeah, there's kind of a life-size picture, right? Pretty freaking huge tube here. Yeah, what's up, Irene? Question?
Right. Yeah. Where does the throw up take place? Where and when?
When you like vomit?
No, the blood. When it, you said it's like our digestive system, like it's like us throwing up when the blood releases.
Oh, when your blood it ejects all of its little organelles?
Yeah.
That takes place before your blood cells enter your bloodstream. That happens in your bones. So I didn't mention it earlier, but your bones are what make your blood cells. So you've got white blood cells and red blood cells, right? So you've got red bone marrow, which is like located throughout the kind of main body of the bone. And so this is actually, when we're looking at the marrow part of your bones, this is where your blood cells are getting created, right? Throughout this section here. Then you've also got white bone marrow, which is where that's where like your immune system gets created. That's happening in like the heads. So that's what we call like spongy bone versus hard bone. The spongy bone is what makes like your white blood cells, and the hard bone is what makes your red blood cells. But that's where you're gonna find like bone marrow, right? And so actually, there we go. That's so funny. I didn't even look up the blood cell life cycle, but there it is. We were talking about bone marrow. So it's made in the marrow, and then right before it exits the bones and gets into your bloodstream, so that it can go to the liver it'll go to the liver for the very first time, then it will travel to your heart for the very first time. And it goes to the liver first because sometimes it will actually pick up the ingredients to make new red blood cells. This is kind of fun. But when your blood cells are worn out, and your red blood cells are ready to kind of die because they don't carry oxygen anymore, eventually they get into your liver, and your liver chews them up and spits out the ingredients in order to make new red blood cells from their old parts. And that goes to this area, and I love this. It's called the red blood cell graveyard. That is its actual scientific term. And so travels through the spleen into your liver, and then gets sort of destroyed there. But before a blood cell like actually enters the bloodstream, it spits all that out while it's still in your bones. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was a fun life cycle.
Weird, right? Isn't that kind of cool? Yeah. It's like all of our blood cells are recycled. And I just love that name, the Red Blood Cell Graveyard. That's gonna be the name of my heavy metal band. All right, so arteries, again, they carry blood away from the heart. Now you do have smaller versions. Remember, like I said, the aorta is huge, right? And then your arteries are huge as well. So that is going to supply almost too much blood throughout the body, right? And so what we have instead, what'll happen is if you look at like blood vessel size, if you look at your blood vessels, what'll actually happen is they'll branch into smaller and smaller and smaller sections. There's a great little picture right here. You can kind of see huge blood vessel in your aorta, right? Then you've got like, it becomes a smaller, where it's a much smaller tube like an artery. It gets a little bit smaller, and then eventually it becomes what we call an arteriole, which is a miniature version of an artery, right? So arterioles are blood vessels carrying blood away from the heart that have branched off of your arteries, and they're much, much smaller. And then eventually they become microscopic. They become capillaries, which are super tiny. Capillaries are really, really, really small. In fact, here's a weird fact about capillaries. Sometimes the vessel is actually smaller than a red blood cell. And that's like, wait a minute, it's the tube that a blood cell travels through. How could the tube be smaller than the cell? Well, remember, that's why blood cells have that weird shape. That allows them to fold and move through this little tiny tube, and then they can pop back to regular size. And what that does is that generates, you guessed it, pressure, right? So when it has a hard time squeezing through, and then it shoots through finally. So your capillaries are so small. They're so small, in fact, you can break them very, very easily, actually. Like if I punched myself in the eye right now, right, I would give myself a black eye, right? What is happening is like I broke a bunch of capillaries, and those capillaries started leaking out, and now I have a bruise. That's what's happening. Whenever you get a bruise, you broke a bunch of capillaries. And ladies, unfortunately, smaller bodies, you've got smaller blood vessels. That's why women tend to bruise easier than men do, if you've ever wondered why. That's also why your hands are colder than men's. My two ladies in the room. I don't know if you guys actually get that or not. Not everybody does, but when you get like the really cold hands, smaller blood vessels, unfortunately, just don't hold on to heat quite as effectively. And that's why,
that means you have a warm heart. Yeah,
cold hands, warm heart. I love that phrase. My mom used to say that, and I love that. But yeah, that's why if you're in a relationship, you can never agree on the thermostat. So that is our arteries. Arteries are really large. They carry blood away from the heart. Arterioles are a little bit smaller. Then it branches into capillaries, which are microscopic. And capillaries, they form these big beds. You can kind of see they're sort of simulating that here. But if you look at like a capillary bed, it covers your tissues like crazy. It creates this big webbing all over your tissues, right? There's a great picture. You can actually see there's your lymphatic system, which is how you move fluids throughout your body. But like here's like the tissues, right? And it just covers it with this webbing, right? And like if you look at the blood vessels running throughout your body, it looks kind of like this. Look at how crazy covered you are in this hollow set of tubes, right? And this isn't even accurate because, I mean, these are people that created these blood vessels. A lot of these things are so small, guys, you can't actually see them. They are microscopic in size. So the ones that you're seeing in these diagrams, these are actually the big ones. So they cover your tissues like crazy. Then what'll happen after you've got your capillaries, those capillaries will start to come together. And so like, it went artery, which branched into arterioles, right? And those arterioles branched into capillaries. And then eventually your capillaries will start coming together and they'll start forming what are called venules. And venules are really small versions of veins because now it already delivered the oxygen, so it's got to get back to the body, right? Back to the heart, rather. So venules are smaller versions of veins. Veins carry blood back toward the heart. So again, blood would travel through an artery, That would branch down to become an arteriole, which would branch down to become a capillary. Those capillaries would come together to form a venule. That venule would come together to form a vein, and then it would get back to your heart. And the cycle would repeat. So you think of it as like, I always like to think of it as like a highway to, I'm sorry, I like to think of it as like a freeway to a highway to a street, deliver, then you stop at your house, pick up your stuff, and then you get back on the street, back onto the highway, back onto the freeway.
Oh, that's a great visual. I love that.
Yeah, to wherever it is you're going. So that is your blood vessels. You guys feeling good on blood vessels? We have any questions, comments, concerns on those? Anybody worried about knowing those?
Can you squirrel up? I can't speak. Can you scroll up just for a second, Brad?
Scroll up, yeah.
So I can see the.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Eugenia, you said you're feeling good. I saw you tune in for a second there.
No, I'm good. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so now let's move on. We talked about the cardiovascular system. Let's talk about the respiratory system. So your respiratory system, talking about the lungs. The lungs are responsible for, providing your body with cellular function, which sounds kind of weird when you're like, isn't it in charge of breathing? Well, remember, breathing is all about bringing in oxygen. Your cells cannot survive without oxygen. So this is how you do cellular function. You have to be able to breathe. And so their primary role is to ensure proper cellular functioning by providing a means to gather oxygen from the environment. Here's what's weird about the air that we breathe every day. Most of the air, guys, is actually nitrogen. I always forget how much it's supposed to be. Air components, freaking always forget. I need a pie chart. Yeah, it's only about 20% oxygen. Like 78% of the air is nitrogen. 20% of it is oxygen. Then there's like helium and hydrogen and even things like krypton in the air, like little tiny radioactive elements in the air there. And so like your lungs are what filter to ensure that the only thing we let into our bloodstream is oxygen, right? And so that's really what it's there for. It's there to kind of filter things out and also provide a means by which your blood vessels can kind of get exposed to that air so they can pick up that oxygen. So your respiratory system is going to work with your cardiovascular system to, deliver oxygen throughout the body. And when you look at it, when you look at your respiratory system, it's comprised of two main sections. It's going to be comprised of your respiratory pump, which is all the stuff that like drives like massive amounts of gas into the area, and your respiratory passageways, which is where oxygen can get into your bloodstream. So you see like the pump here in like your lungs, right? And then see all these little branches right here. Those branches end in these little sacs that are covered. That doesn't look very covered in this picture, but they're covered in little capillary beds. And that's where oxygen and gases can be exchanged. So when we look at the respiratory pump, right, we are looking at, it's located in your thoracic cavity. That's your rib cage, right? It's located in the mediastinum area. And it's responsible for providing like a framework and flexibility to allow for, breathing, right? And so when we talk about like breathing, we divide it into two phases. You've got breathing in versus breathing out. You've got inspiration, that's driving air in, you're inspiring, right? Which is why when you're inspired, you go, oh, I have an idea, That's not true, but I love saying that. That's inhalation, driving gas in. And then you've got expiration, which is the exhalation. You're expelling gas from your lungs. So what happens is you're generating pressure again, right? These are pressure changes. Only this time, instead of pressure with liquid like blood, we have pressure with gas like air. So that's the respiratory pump. It's things like your diaphragm, right? So like your diaphragm is this little muscle that lives underneath, you've got lungs right here and your diaphragm's underneath it. And it's this little dome-shaped muscle. It kind of looks like that, like a little dome. And what happens is when it squeezes, when the diaphragm contracts, it goes like this. It actually flattens down like that. That's its contraction. It rests like this and it contracts like that. And so it rests, contracts, rests, contracts. And when it flattens down like that, that's drawing my lungs open. So then when I contract that down, air comes rushing into my lungs. Then when it relaxes, air goes and pushes out of my lungs. So what's funny about breathing, and I know this seems kind of surprising, but breathing, the active part of breathing is actually breathing in. That's the contraction phase. Breathing out is the relaxation phase. So you breathe in when you contract and you breathe out when you relax. Now, obviously, there's secondary breathing, which is where you're blowing out like birthday candles and you go, that's where you contract things like your abdominals, which pushes up your diaphragm and drives all that oxygen out. So that's actually sort of the opposite there, right? You know what? Hold on one second. I got a weird situation. One of my roommates is trying to put a dresser out for the garbage to come pick up, and I think somebody wants it. Okay, sorry. I know that was weird. So that's your respiratory system, right? It's the pump is going to drive air into and out of your lungs. So the muscles are the diaphragm. They're also like your external intercostal muscles. Those are the little muscles in between each of your ribs. You get these little tiny muscles that kind of make this X motion, and that keeps your ribs in place. Your scalenes, which are actually in your neck, actually assist in kind of moving your rib cage around. Your sternocleidomastoid, which is this thick muscle right here on the front of your neck, that actually lifts up your collarbone, which allows air to kind of drive in. And then even your pectoral muscles, your chest muscle, the minor one, which is the short one right here, that actually, again, moves your rib cage around and draws air in whatever direction it's going. So that is your respiratory pump. It's this series of little muscles, and even your sternum and your rib cage, it's this that's nice and heavy. That actually, when it, pushes back down, that drives air out of your lungs, which again is very passive. So the weight of your rib cage is still part of the pump. But primarily what we're going to spend most of our time talking about is our respiratory passageways. And your respiratory passageways are the passageways with which air is able to kind of travel through to get to your bloodstream, right? So these are the passageways that allow these gases to travel into and out of your lungs. And there's two kind of main sections here. There's the main conduction passageway, and then there's the actual little sacs, which are the respiratory part of the passageways. So your conduction passageways, that's like your nose, right? You've got tubes up here in your nose, your nasal cavity, but also your oral cavity, right? There's air that's able to travel through your mouth. They both connect at your pharynx, which eventually becomes your larynx, and then eventually becomes your trachea, which you can feel if you very gently poke right here, right? Like that little, this sort of a tube made of cartilage. That's your trachea. And that's also where, remember yesterday we talked about the thyroid? It lives right about here. And then what will happen is once it travels down your trachea, it will split, and actually I'll pull the picture up right here. It will split into two different sections, right? So there's, like I said, there's your nasal cavity. Your pharynx is where they're about to meet, right? Oral cavity, nasal cavity. And then there's your larynx. That's where your vocal cords are. And then that comes down and becomes your trachea. There's that cartilage tube that we mentioned, right? And then it'll branch into these two different sections here. It'll branch into the right section over here and the left section over here. These are called your bronchi. So you've got your right bronchi and your left bronchi. And when you look at them, those little branches there, that is where it's about to branch out like crazy. So I've got a really good picture I saw a second ago. That's kind of what your lungs look like. Now, this is totally inaccurate. This is not, it's not blue and red. I don't know why they did that in this picture, but this picture is great for showing you the structures, right? So there's your, trachea, and then there's your your right bronchi and your left bronchi, right? It is not oxygenated and deoxygenated. Do not let this fool you. In fact, actually, there we go. Let's go ahead and kill that debate. There's what it actually looks like. And so take a look here. What it does, you'll notice it branches out smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. It's got all these really interesting little tiny branches. And you can see in those different branches, they get smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually they end in these little microscopic sacs called your alveoli. So alveoli are actually at the very end of every one of those little tubes. So, oh, there we go. That's great. So it branches out and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually it ends in these little, they kind of look like popcorn, right? These little popcorn shaped sacs here. And then look at how they are absolutely covered in blood vessels, right? And because they are covered in all these like blood vessels, that is right here. This is where oxygen is transported into your bloodstream, or CO2 is transported out of your bloodstream. So the exchange site for oxygen is happening at the end of these branches, right? So big branch, smaller branch, smaller branch, smaller, and then small, 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 until eventually it's this little tiny like popcorn sac, right? Your respiratory passageways, that's your conduction passageway and your respiratory passageway, which is the alveoli and the little alveolar sacs. Technically, and nobody ever makes this distinction, but technically this branch is the alveoli and the sac is the sac, but that is your respiratory system's anatomy. That's sort of the structure there. Any questions on how that's shaped or anything like that? You guys feeling good? Love it. Okay, so let's scroll down and take a look at how okay, so now we finally get to look at all of this as it's working, right? Let's look at the function of all of this, right? Your cardiorespiratory function. So in general, guys, your oxygen consumption when you are at rest, so your cardiovascular and your respiratory systems, they make up your cardiorespiratory system, right? So we've talked about the cardiovascular system. We just got done talking about the respiratory system. Putting them together, that's your cardiorespiratory system. And the respiratory system gathers the oxygen. The cardiovascular system pumps that oxygen throughout the body, right? In the form of blood carrying oxygen. Now, your cells are going to eat that oxygen, right? So what's going to happen is cells oxygen consumption, right? So what's going to happen to a cell, I must have Googled a term that I'm not using it the right way. Yeah. Cellular respiration, blood cell. That'll work. Okay. So when you look at like how your body's tissues are consuming this oxygen, right? What's going to happen is if a cell needs oxygen and a red blood cell has a bunch of oxygen, that blood cell is going to go over here and it's going to detach that oxygen molecule from that molecule of hemoglobin that we talked about earlier. So now that oxygen is going to be drawn to your tissues. It'll be drawn to the cells, right? And then your cell, because it just got done like using that oxygen from like the last time it like ate up some oxygen, now it's got some carbon dioxide, some CO2 as a byproduct. So it's going to spit out CO2 and that's going to be picked up by your blood cell. So at your body's tissue level, what's happening is your cells are consuming the oxygen and then they're left with CO2 afterwards, right? That's their waste product. In the same way that you bring in food and expel waste, your cells are bringing in oxygen and expelling CO2, right? So that's what's happening in the gas exchange at a tissue level in the body. In the lungs, it's exactly the opposite, right? Like your lungs are dropping off CO2 and picking up oxygen. So that's what's a blood cell is kind of doing, right? A blood cell will travel to a tissue, drop off its oxygen, pick up its CO2, go back to the lungs, drop off its CO2, pick up its oxygen, and then travel back to another tissue. And so like that's happening constantly in your body. That's how that exchange is happening. Now, we call that oxygen consumption, right? Because that's what your cells are doing. They're consuming that oxygen. The resting amount of oxygen that you're going to consume, guys, on average is about 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of your body weight per minute. So we call that a MET, or a metabolic equivalent. So if you are at rest, let's say you're sleeping, right? And you weigh, I am so bad with metric, 40 kilograms, which I think is a lot. Is it? I don't know. Let's say you weigh 100, let's say you weigh 40 kilograms, right? You're going to consume 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of your body weight per minute. So if you weigh 40 kilograms times 3.5, you know, you're consuming about 14 milliliters of oxygen per minute when you're at rest. Now, obviously, you guys are sitting upright right now, listening, you know, unless some of you are in bed, you know, listening to this lecture. Maybe some of you are standing, somebody's at the grocery store, like whatever. So you're not completely at rest. So if I were to hook you up to a tube and measure how much oxygen you're consuming, I can measure how many METs you are burning per minute, which is somewhat helpful, although we don't usually use METs because it requires like a lot of big fancy equipment. But what that tells me is that tells me how much harder you are working than if you were at rest. And I can tie that amount of work to your metabolism. Like if I knew that you burn 2,000 calories per day, right, every single day, which is actually, that's too many. Let's say you're burning, you know, 1,500 to 1,600 calories per day, but then I hook you up to a machine and I measure your METs and you're burning at 2 METs, right? Well, then that means that like you're not burning 1,600 calories per day. You're probably burning way more than that. You're probably burning, you know, 2,400 or 3,200, you know, somewhere in there. So that's how we use METs, or metabolic equivalents, to measure like your intensity. But to be fair, guys, you're really not going to do, the METs really aren't going to work that way. You're not really going to use METs that often. You'll see a MET on a treadmill every now and then. It'll say like, you know, you'll punch your information in and you'll get on a treadmill and go however many miles per hour. And it'll estimate and say, hey, you're burning, you know, 3 METs per hour. Well, 1 MET, that 3.5 milliliters per minute, that's you at rest, right? So that means you're burning 3 times as many calories right now as you would have been than if you were at rest. And that's kind of a cool way to use METs. I like to use every now and then just to motivate my clients. I'll be like, hey, you're burning 7 times as many calories right now than you would be if you were, you know, laying around at home. So that's great. You know, there's a much better use of your time. You know, like I kind of like to use it as a motivating factor, but for the most part, you're not going to use it that often. What we'll often use instead is your VO2 max. And this is the maximum amount of oxygen that you can consume. And here's what we know about like oxygen consumption. If you have cells that are really hungry and they are consuming lots and lots and lots of oxygen, that means that you have like a very metabolically intense body. This is the best way to gauge actual cardiorespiratory fitness. So if I've got 2 people, let's go back to earlier, right? They both weigh 150 pounds, the same, you know, they're identical twins, but one of them is exercised every day and one of them barely ever exercises. The one who exercises every day, their cells have developed the ability to consume more oxygen. So your cells will actually change in response to exercise. Oh, we lost somebody. Oh, yeah. Your cells will adapt to exercise. If I exercise really often, what'll happen is my body will get better and better and better at utilizing oxygen because it'll make more of the things that consume oxygen. Now, I'm not going to get too much into this today, but if we look at like what a mitochondria is, this is this little organelle that lives inside all of your cells, and this is where we consume oxygen and convert that oxygen into energy. This is where we consume it. The more work you do, guys, the more mitochondria your cells are going to make. The more mitochondria that your cells have, the more energy that you can convert and you can do more work. So this is one of the reasons why we want to measure someone's VO2 max, right? So if we look at like, if you look at your VO2 max scores, right, what we want to see is we want to see somebody be able to consume, like this is for men, let's say somebody's between 20 and 29, we want them to consume somewhere between 42.5 to 46.4 milliliters of oxygen per minute, right, on average. If they're only consuming 33, that means their cells don't have very much mitochondria and they can't use oxygen very efficiently. They're going to get out of breath really, really quickly because maybe there's plenty of oxygen coming in, but they're just not using very much of it, right? They don't have the cell's capacity to use it. You can bring, when you're out of breath, guys, what's funny about being out of breath is, it sounds like you're like, oh, I just feel like I can't get any air. Like you feel like you're wiped, you're exhausted, right? It's not that you don't get enough oxygen. There's actually plenty of oxygen, but your cells are consuming all of it because they can't, you don't have as much mitochondria to use, right? So that's why the VO2 max is a great way to estimate someone's cardiovascular fitness levels. That's why we do one of our assessments called the Rockport Walk Test, right? That's the one that estimates your VO2 max. Now, obviously, there are dysfunctional breathing patterns. There's ways to kind of mess up your ability to bring in all of this gas, these gases that we're talking about, this oxygen, right? And so we will see sometimes like alterations in breathing patterns, and that can also screw up your energy production. You can't bring in as much gas. That gas then can't get delivered to your cells. Your cells are exhausted. They can't produce any more energy, right? So generally what we look for as like a dysfunctional breathing is a shallow breathing pattern. Shallow breathing patterns are where you see somebody who breathes little tiny ones like that. And you'll notice I'm kind of moving my upper body a lot rather than breathing the way we're supposed to. Remember, your diaphragm is what contracts to draw air in, right? So I'm supposed to breathe from here. I'm supposed to breathe from my stomach. But if I breathe from my chest, right, that is a dysfunctional breathing pattern. This cannot draw as much air in as this, right? And I know your lungs are here, but you want to breathe and you want to see your stomach kind of pooch a little bit. That's a sign that you're breathing, we call it diaphragmatically. So shallow breathing patterns tend to rely on your secondary respiratory muscles, right? Those are all those ones up in your neck or in your chest, rather than relying on your diaphragm. And your diaphragm is your primary breathing muscle. But there's often dysfunction. We often work desk jobs where we're doing this all day, which means I'm squeezing those secondary muscles. So now those secondary muscles are like, I want to help breathe, right? Or our head gets in this, we're looking at the computer, right? So those secondary muscles get so used to being worked in other ways that they start to affect our breathing patterns. And that alters your posture, right? So when we see like what is called upper crossed syndrome, which is where you see somebody who has a posture kind of like this, right? They have that forward head, they've got those rounded shoulders, right? That is going to lead to dysfunctional breathing patterns. And that's why you'll often hear people describe, when they've got this type of posture, they'll often describe that they get like tension headaches in the back. They often feel like they're out of breath. They get side stitches when they're running, all those kind of things, right? So alterations in your breathing patterns are an example of dysfunctional breathing. So during these shallow breaths, your secondary muscles are used more often. Then that causes them to get stronger. And then they start to take over for normal breathing, which is not what we want. If this shallow upper chest breathing becomes habitual, it can cause overuse of the muscles, including your scalenes, your sternocleidomastoid, your levator scapulae, and your upper trapezius. Eugenia, these are all muscles I will teach you later. So I know that it's a lot right now. So these are our upper neck muscles, and that can alter things. That can mess up your posture because those muscles, right, like my levator scapulae, right, that's this one on the back of my neck here. It tries to help me breathe, but you know what it does instead? Raises my shoulders up, right? It's supposed to do this. I don't want that to happen when I'm breathing, right? That's not good. So that alters our ability to move. It alters our biomechanics, right? We can't move the way we're designed to move now. And so that can result when you start like exercising, that can give you tension back here, which can cause a headache. It can cause lightheadedness or dizziness. And obviously it changes like how you actually move. So a lot of times when we have these dysfunctional breathing patterns, we need to loosen up these muscles, right? And I'm going to teach you guys this in a few days. We're going to go through how to sort of get this upper neck posture fixed. But let's say I look at those secondary respiratory muscles, right? Those helper muscles that are doing too much work. Sometimes it's my pec minor, little tiny one right underneath my main chest muscles. Sometimes it's the sterno, the upper traps, and the levator. So if you ever do find that you have like a tension headache, I do this to my mom all the time because my mom's got really bad posture. I've taught her this 1,000 times. She forgets it every time. But if you ever get like a tension headache back here, guys, some of the best things you can do is actually do like a pec minor stretch, which your pec minor is in charge of shoulder protraction, right? So you're really going to retract your shoulders. This is where you do that straight arm pec stretch. I really like this one too. But particularly this is going to be super helpful. So I would, place it against like the wall, and I would stretch away like this, and I'd breathe into my stomach, right? I'd really focus on breathing down here. And I'm also not going to let my shoulder raise. I'm going to drop my shoulder down. So I'm going to stretch out that pec there, probably going to do about 30 seconds. Then I'm going to move up to my neck. So I got to get the front of my neck stretched, right? So I'm going to go right here and stretch that out for about 30 seconds. Then I'm going to tilt my head to the side, stretch that out for about 30 seconds. Then I got to get the back of the neck. So I'm going to tilt down for about 30 seconds. And then I'll probably repeat, I'll probably do the other side, and then I'll repeat the whole thing. I'll do 2 sets of about 30 seconds each on those. And that is a great way. If you find that you've been at the desk all day and you're just getting this like rounded posture, that can really help you get back to upright. We can also talk about how to strengthen those muscles too, which will draw you into that posture and get you strong and standing tall. But we'll look at that definitely later in this course. So let's go ahead and summarize everything up, right? So your respiratory system, it's going to gather oxygen from your environment, right? It's going to inhale it through the nose and through the mouth and get that tissue into the body so that it can be exposed to your blood vessels. And then those blood vessels are going to transport that oxygen to your body's tissues. And as your body's tissues use that cell, as your cells use that oxygen, they're going to spit out CO2, carbon dioxide, in response. And that's going to get transported back to the heart and lungs so that you can get it out of the body, right? And this is all made possible thanks to your respiratory pump, which is drawing air in, and your respiratory passageways, which are allowing oxygen to travel to where they need to go. If there is dysfunction in your cardiorespiratory system, either the heart or the lungs, it's going to affect your entire body because you are not delivering nutrients the way you are supposed to. So that's going to have some really negative effects there. And that is about it for the cardiorespiratory system. How's everybody feeling? Yeah, what's up, Irene?
The highlight of a much clearer understanding because of the visual picture you showed us with the aorta to the artery to the capillaries to the vein. Oh
Yeah.
my God, the picture fucking rocks.
Oh, awesome. Good. Yeah, smaller and smaller, right? It's great. I love that.
I'm like, oh, that's how
um,
it gets. Okay, I see it clearly. Thank you for that.
yeah, of course, no problem. Um, great. Eugenia, how you feeling? Day 2. Oh, did we lose her?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here. Hi.
Are you feeling good?
Yeah,
Awesome.
thank you.
Well, guys, I actually don't have anything else for you. So if you haven't gotten homework 1 turned in, please knock that out for me. This is your chapter 3. So today, guys, I would definitely recommend going through chapter 3 of your NASM if you can, and just review all of that. Robert, you get that audiobook quiz review thing. Today's a good day for it. Maybe put it on while you're going for a run and train the cardiovascular system. Knock out 2 birds with 1 stone. So I definitely recommend, please read chapter 3 and study up on that. And yeah, I will see you guys tomorrow. So tomorrow, we are actually we're really changing directions tomorrow. We're going to look at our human movement science. We got a lot of terminology tomorrow, but we are going to look at sort of that flexion, extension stuff. We're going to get back into sort of the kinesiology of everything tomorrow. That's going to be chapter 4 of your NASM. So we're knocking out chapter 3 today. We're going to knock out chapter 4 tomorrow. But other than that, if you guys are out of here, I will see all y'all tomorrow morning or tonight if anybody's doing a double.
Thank you. Bye.
You're welcome. I'll see you.
See you guys.
See you later, man.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.